The monkey. You know, the primate? Well, it's also a zodiac sign, a sign in the Chinese zodiac. The monkey in this zodiac represents specific values, a positive cleverness, intelligence, talent, mental flexibility, and genius. In contrast to the common opinion developed in the West, which identifies this primate as a deceitful beast, sometimes foolish, overly playful, or even lazy or disloyal, for the people of the Far East, the monkey is an animal with a profound auspicious meaning. It brings good fortune. And it is with these premises of a prosperous and rich year of the monkey, full of positive news, that between January 30th and 31, 1968, the Vietnamese people prepared to welcome the new zodiac sign at the beginning of the year, according to the lunar calendar known as TET, the Lunar New Year. This occasion has always been experienced as a special moment, much like in the classical Mediterranean world when the Olympic Games imposed a truce. The sacred nature of the occasion imposes a sort of suspension of any hostility. And that is what everyone expects on that night between January 30th and 31, 1968, in former Indochina, a territory divided and devastated by years and years of war. As we know, after gaining independence from the French, Indochina fragmented into three distinct entities: the Kingdom of Cambodia, Laos, and, most notably, Vietnam, which was divided by a border. This border was drawn along a parallel, similar to what had already happened further north in Korea. It was meant to be a temporary border, awaiting a referendum that would never take place. A referendum intended to allow the population to decide which form of government would be chosen: a socialist republic, as was emerging in the north, or a Western-style republic. Initially, the South was under the tutelage of the former emperor, Bao Dai. However, as mentioned, that referendum would never happen. Instead, skirmishes began, followed by a full-scale war that would directly involve the American giant, the United States, along with some allies, starting with Australia, and indirectly the socialist world, led by China, with some support from the Soviet Union. But let's go back to that night, the night of Tet in 1968. At midnight, fireworks lit up the sky, and in the southern part of the country, both civilians and soldiers enjoyed the spectacle. No one, absolutely no one in the South imagined that in just a few moments, the traditional firecrackers would be followed by real artillery shells and ground offensives. Not even the American contingent expected it, a force present since 1964. Everyone believed it was simply a local holiday. The only units on alert were those stationed at Hue and Khe Sanh, two bases attacked in the previous weeks by the regular North Vietnamese army and in a constant state of danger. In the rest of the camps, American personnel were generally relaxed. The U.S. Army intelligence remained active only for troop movements around Khe Sanh, but generally relied on the usual TET truce, officially declared with the decision to observe a sort of weekly ceasefire. How wrong those predictions were, the American soldiers would find out only a few minutes after midnight. For months, the North had been preparing for a major offensive. After years of guerrilla warfare in the jungles and on the heights, of quick skirmishes and clashes, North Vietnam was ready to launch a full-scale attack, exploiting the element of surprise. The operational plan was devised by a man who represented a living nightmare for the Westerners in Vietnam. His name is Võ Nguyên Giáp, a general who, about 10 years earlier, had forced the French to surrender at Dien Bien Phu, a topic we've already covered in a dedicated video. It was a siege that triggered a profound crisis within the French military and political establishment. From that moment, everything changed, including the consciousness of the army, and they began to talk about unconventional warfare. But these are other topics that we've already discussed and will address in other videos. Returning to Võ Nguyên Giáp, he is a very interesting figure, even for Westerners. Many legends have arisen about him, some true, others fabricated. For example, it is said that Võ is cold, a ruthless strategist who has had a grudge against the French ever since his wife was arrested and later died of typhoid in a rat-infested cell. It is also said that it was Giap himself who invented all the explosive traps left under abandoned corpses in the streets, or the traps filled with poisonous wasps, the jungle pitfalls that massacre soldiers with sharpened logs hidden in ditches covered by underbrush. Well, where reality ends and legends begin, no one really knows. However, Giap is not just a feared name. He is a legend, a sharp strategist who, after driving out the French, is refining his methods against the Americans, who have intervened to support the Southern regime. In fact, Giap is not considered an extremist by us, Instead, quite the opposite, more of a politician. Some within the Vietnamese Communist Party circle consider him too soft, a man who would prefer to use diplomacy instead of rifles and bayonets. To prove it, Giap carries out the orders, but is not entirely convinced of the effectiveness of a full-scale offensive that would fully involve both the regular North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong movement, which has so far borne much of the war effort in the various pinprick attacks in the south, pushed by the hawks who want a quick victory. To distance himself from the USSR and win over Mao, who has long been secretly supporting the North's war effort, Giap devised a structured plan that involved the large-scale deployment of forces never before used, and the Viet Cong were tasked with launching the offensive in the major cities of the south. Meanwhile, the regular North Vietnamese troops, already partially engaged at Dak To and Khe Sanh, would bypass the 17th parallel border, where the demilitarized zone was located, the boundary between the two states. The regular troops were to attack the old imperial capital of Hue, a large city south of the Perfume River. But let's return to those moments. After midnight on January 31st, the offensive forces began to move. From the north, a terrifying bombardment commenced, striking 2 American bases. This barrage preceded ground assaults, which were ultimately repelled by the entrenched defenders of the camps. However, alongside these assault attempts, the North Vietnamese forces penetrated the border with 2 infantry divisions in just over 24 hours and occupied Hue. But Hue wasn't the only target of the offensive. In Saigon, the capital of the South, the Americans were left in shock after a Viet Cong suicide squad attacked the U.S. Embassy, penetrating the building before being completely eliminated by the security teams. It was unprecedented for the main symbol of American presence in Vietnam, the embassy, to be breached, even for a couple of days. The combined forces of the North and the Viet Cong seemed to dominate, taking advantage of both the South's weak defenses and the unpreparedness of the Americans and their Australian allies. After a quick reorganization, General William Westmoreland, the commander-in-chief of operations, ordered a counteroffensive. The objectives were to retake Hue and save Khe Sanh, which was isolated and now only resupplied from the air. It was clear to everyone that Giap wanted to turn Khe Sanh into another Dien Bien Phu. The tactical plan was identical. The same script: infantry surrounding the perimeter, howitzers hammering the positions, and the airstrip as a vital objective. Once that airstrip was closed, there would be no escape for the defenders. Westmoreland was risking a significant portion of his credibility. Only a few months earlier, he had assured his superiors in Washington that the enemy had no chance of winning the war. Now he found himself with his back against the wall. Pressured by the media, Westmoreland was forced to make statements that would later sound grotesque in the long run. "We will not be defeated," he said. "I repeat, we will not be defeated. At Khe Sanh, I will not allow anyone to say or even think otherwise." On the ground, however, the situation quickly became critical. The Air Force's C-130S couldn't even land. They had to drop supplies on the airstrip with mobile carts equipped with parachutes and then immediately gain altitude to avoid being destroyed by enemy ground fire. On the surrounding heights, American soldiers did everything they could, contesting every single meter of land against the attackers at the cost of severe losses. Only after 3 months of a terrible siege did the intervention of the air cavalry and the paratroopers of the 101st finally give the defenders some relief, though they ultimately chose to abandon the position, demolishing the entire base. In Hue, the situation was equally complicated. The regular North Vietnamese forces occupied the city and its suburbs, including the old imperial residence, a jewel, a magnificent architectural reproduction of the Forbidden City in Beijing. Westmoreland is unwavering. He demands a complete reconquest, even if it means leveling every single building. Significant reinforcements are brought in, including M50 Ontos anti-tank vehicles, equipped with 6 recoilless rifles. Highly effective weapons for destroying machine gun nests. For weeks, the battle rages house by house, with the constant nightmare of ambushes and snipers. Remember Full Metal Jacket? It wasn't a dramatization. Nothing was invented. That's exactly how it went. The Battle of Hue, a block-by-block reconquest filled with the terror of being caught by explosive traps, ambushed, or picked off by isolated snipers. The North Vietnamese forces retreated step by step, but they left behind nothing but death and destruction. By the end of the reconquest, Hue was reduced to a pile of smoldering rubble. 90% of the buildings were destroyed, and the number of refugees was beyond counting. But let's return to Full Metal Jacket, the final scene where the patrol walks through the flames, singing the Mickey Mouse Club theme. Nothing about that was invented, that's exactly how it happened. While the TET Offensive was a military and tactical failure for North Vietnam, with Giap ultimately winning the internal political battle and leading to the suppression of the Viet Cong as a combat force, the United States was left devastated internally. President Lyndon Johnson, shaken by the events at Khe Sanh, even considered retiring to private life at the end of his term, unknowingly paving the way for Richard Nixon's electoral victory in November. Special Advisor Robert McNamara saw his strategy of a dual-track conflict, where the U.S. Army was only meant to support the regular forces of the South, collapse in one fell swoop. It wasn't enough. The South Vietnamese army was too weak. They lacked conviction, were plagued by desertions, and suffered from immense unpreparedness, not to mention corruption at the highest levels. The escalation in Vietnam became a daily topic of debate within the United States, where opposition to direct involvement grew stronger. Protests intensified, especially after news of the My Lai massacre reached home, where a reconnaissance platoon attacked by the Viet Cong retaliated by slaughtering the defenseless population of an entire village. It was a scandal that shook consciences and fueled the fire of the protests. From that point forward, the United States was forced to navigate between the growing public demand for disengagement and the need to support its increasingly demoralized and exposed Vietnamese ally. 5 years later, the Paris Peace Accords, brokered by Henry Kissinger, would mark the end of the war for the United States, raising the enduring moral question of what is remembered as the first stinging defeat for the American giant.